Before vascular surgery existed, an artery injury in a child meant a simple, brutal equation. Arteries carried blood under pressure. When one tore, blood emptied out fast, and the body had almost no time to compensate. Doctors could press, pack, and tie off what they could reach, but those were not repairs. They were desperate moves to slow the loss, while the real problem kept winning. If the damaged vessel sat deep, or if the tear was large, there was no reliable way to restore the flow. Sewing an artery back together often failed because the inside surface reacted, clots formed, the vessel sealed shut, and even when bleeding stopped, the next danger arrived. Tissue beyond the injury lost its blood supply. In a child, that loss became irreversible with frightening speed. So surgeons faced a choice that never felt like a choice. Stop the bleeding by sacrificing the artery, or watch the child bleed out. Either way, survival remained unlikely. A limb could die even if the child lived, and infection often followed damaged tissue. Medicine handled bones, skin, and organs with growing confidence, but blood vessels stayed different. When an artery failed, the clock ran out. He entered medicine at a moment when surgeons mostly accepted the limits of blood vessels. They tied off arteries to stop bleeding and hoped the body found a way around the damage. As a young surgeon who also chased research questions, he hated that helplessness. He watched patients decline from a single torn tube of tissue, and he began to ask a dangerous question. What if the vessel itself could be fixed? That question changed how he looked at the body. He stopped seeing an artery as sacred and untouchable and started seeing it as a working line that carried pressure like a pipe. If pipes could be cut, aligned, and reconnected, why not vessels, if the work was careful enough? The idea sounded almost disrespectful. It also sounded practical, and once it took hold, it refused to leave him alone. His ambition narrowed into a single obsession. He studied how blood behaved at a cut edge, how quickly it clotted, how a rough touch could ruin everything. Each failure pushed him toward a simple belief. The problem was not that vessels could not be handled, but that surgeons had not learned how. If a blood vessel could be treated like replaceable plumbing, then injury stopped being a sentence and became a repair job. He moved from ideas to proof. He took healthy arteries and treated them like a test, not a mystery. First, he cut a vessel cleanly, then brought the two ends back together. Everyone expected the same failure as before. The blood would hit the damaged edge, clot, and block the line. That was the fear that stopped the whole field, so the only question mattered. Could the join stay open? He learned the enemy was rough handling. If he pinched the vessel, twisted it, or let the inner lining scrape, the repair failed fast. A clot formed like a plug, but when his movements stayed light and controlled, the result changed. He placed tiny stitches so the edges met evenly, without gaps and without bunching. The artery did not just hold, it carried blood through the seam, minute after minute. That outcome rewrote what an artery was allowed to be. It was not a fragile tube that rebelled the moment it was touched. It was a living channel with rules. Respect the lining, align the cut, keep tension low, and blood kept moving. Each successful join built confidence because it happened more than once. The experiments turned a hope into a method. Now he could think beyond repair. He could think about replacement. He moved from simply reconnecting arteries to a harder question. What happened when a piece of vessel came from somewhere else? He took a short segment of artery from a dog, still living tissue, and prepared it like a replacement part. The challenge was basic and brutal. Once detached, would it stay open, or would blood instantly clot and seal it shut? He placed that dog artery segment into a new position, then stitched its ends to the receiving vessel with the same delicate, exact technique he had been refining. Every stitch mattered. too tight, and the opening narrowed, too rough, and the inner lining tore. Then came the moment of truth. Blood entered the graft, met foreign tissue, and still kept moving forward. The result changed what a surgeon could even imagine doing. The graft did not behave like dead tubing. It carried blood as a living conduit, long enough to prove the principle. A transplanted artery could function inside a different body. That meant a missing segment no longer automatically meant disaster. For the first time, replacement started to look possible, not just repair. Then the idea faced its first real test outside the lab. A child arrived in crisis, not with a clean cut that could be stitched, but with an artery that was missing a usable length. The vessel did not meet end to end. Blood could not be controlled for long without sacrificing what that artery fed. The usual choices narrowed fast: tie it off and risk permanent damage, or watch the child slip away. In cases like this, speed usually decided everything. Pressure and bandages bought minutes, not solutions. A surgeon could clamp and sew, but only if there was enough healthy artery left to hold a stitch. Here, there was a gap, and the edges were failing. Even if bleeding slowed, the deeper danger stayed in place. Without a working channel, oxygen stopped reaching tissue, and tissue that stayed starved did not recover. For the doctor, it became the moment his earlier work pointed toward, and also the moment it stopped being theoretical. He had already seen that a transplanted artery could carry blood in an experiment. Now a living child needed that same bridge immediately. No standard repair matched what was missing. The emergency did not offer time to wait for perfect conditions. It offered one thing instead: a single chance to try a graft and change the outcome. Time ran out faster than supplies did. The child needed a working artery, and there was no spare human vessel ready to take, no suitable donor, no stored graft. In that moment, every standard option collapsed into the same outcome. The blood flow would fail. The doctor faced a choice that sounded unthinkable outside the lab. He turned to the one source he could control immediately, an artery segment taken from a dog. It was not a bold experiment anymore. It was a rescue attempt with a clock ticking inside the patient's body. The plan had to be simple: remove the damaged section, replace it with the animal artery, and connect the ends so cleanly that blood did not clot and seal it shut. He had practiced this kind of stitching before, but now the stakes were human. One slip meant sudden blockage, bleeding, or irreversible loss. He committed, and the operation moved from idea to action. The dog artery was prepared to serve as a living tube, cut to length and placed where the child's vessel had failed. Then came the hardest part: joining artery to artery, edge to edge, with stitches tight enough to prevent leaks but gentle enough to protect the inner lining. The team had no certainty, only a last resort logic. If the graft held, blood could return. If it did not, there was nothing left. The graft sat in place, and everything depended on one test. Did blood actually move through it? The clamps released, and the team watched for the simplest sign of success. A pulse returned where there had been none. Blood no longer stopped at the injury and pooled uselessly. It crossed the gap. It travelled through the dog's artery segment as if it belonged there. That single change triggered a chain reaction. Downstream tissue that had been starving finally received blood again. Colour and warmth came back. Swelling and bleeding eased as circulation stabilized. It meant the body was not just holding on, it was functioning. The repair was not symbolic. It worked as plumbing. For a moment, the impossible became measurable, and the room shifted from bracing for loss to managing recovery. The child moved out of the immediate danger that had seemed unavoidable just hours earlier. Shock began to lift as blood pressure held. The crisis that had driven the desperate choice ended in survival, and for the medical team, the surprise cut deeper than relief. An animal vessel had carried human blood long enough to save a life. A rule that had governed surgery for generations no longer applied. In the days after the operation, the result had to prove itself hour by hour. The child kept a pulse beyond the repair. The tissue stayed alive. Swelling and fever watched like warning signs, because any clot or infection could have ended the story overnight. But the blood kept moving through that borrowed vessel. Soon, the case stopped being a private miracle and became information. Word travelled the only way it could then, from surgeon to surgeon, through letters, visits, and meetings. The doctor did not treat it as a one-time rescue. He recorded everything. He noted the size of the artery segment, how the ends matched, how the stitches sat, and how quickly the blood returned when the clamps came off. He followed the child over days and then weeks, looking for late blockage, weakening, or failure. Each check that stayed normal turned a shocking outcome into evidence. The message was simple and dangerous. An artery could be replaced and the patient could live. Other surgeons began to test that message. At first, they tried repairs only when there was no other option, because the risk still felt enormous. Some attempts failed, and those failures mattered because they showed exactly where the technique broke down. But some succeeded, and the successful ones spread fastest. Surgeons copied the careful handling, the fine stitching, the insistence on clean edges and good alignment. Over weeks, one extraordinary case started to look less like luck and more like a method. The early success forced surgeons to face a hard truth. The idea worked, but the margin for error stayed tiny. A single rough stitch still triggered a clot, so technique changed first. Needles became finer. Thread became more uniform. Hands learned to touch vessels less, line up edges better, and keep the inner lining from fraying. Suturing stopped being just closing a wound. It became the difference between flow and failure. Then, the graft itself became the next problem to solve. Animal arteries had saved a life, but they did not always stay open, and they carried risks doctors could not control. Surgeons started to prefer tissue taken from the same patient when it was possible, because it behaved more predictably in the body. When that could not happen, they looked for better preserved donor tissue and more careful matching of size and thickness. Over time, the goal shifted from bold rescue to reliable routine. Teams tested new ways to store vessels, reduce infection, and limit the body's reaction to foreign tissue. With each improvement, the need to borrow an artery from an animal weakened. Safer substitutes began to appear, designed to carry blood without the same uncertainty. Early vascular surgery stopped being a gamble. It started to become a system. By the time vascular surgery matured, the old certainty from Chapter 1 had faded. A torn artery no longer meant helpless bleeding and prayers. It meant steps. Surgeons clamped the vessel, restored the pathway, and watched colour and pulse return. Repairs that once sounded impossible became scheduled work, even in the middle of the night. Circulation stopped being a mystery doctors feared. It became something they could fix. They used the patient's own tissue first. A vein from the leg got reversed and turned into an arterial bypass, an autograft that matched the body naturally. When no suitable vein existed, manufactured tubes stepped in. Synthetic grafts designed to stay open and resist clotting. For larger arteries, these materials carried blood for years. For smaller, delicate vessels, microsurgery and better tools made precise reconnection routine. Transplant science pushed the boundary further. Donor vessels and whole organs worked because surgeons learned how to protect tissue, reconnect arteries and veins, and control rejection. None of this happened by accident. It grew from a shift in belief. Damaged blood vessels were not untouchable. They were replaceable. That dog artery operation had marked the hinge point. After it, circulation became repairable and countless lives followed.